Night at Bellissimo. The restaurant was a coin tossed into the dark of January, its polished brass catching the streetlights, a small island of heat against the wind. I'd been working the late shift long enough to know the rhythm. Cut glass laughter upstairs, the clink of forks like distant rainfall, and down below, a steady current of plates and private rooms that swallowed anything personal. I moved through it like someone learning the choreography of a life that wasn't mine. Tray balanced, voice measured, smile on reserve. Table 7 had been quiet most of the night. Marco, the floor manager, liked to put the regulars there when he wanted his favorites close to the kitchen and the door. He slid the song of the evening towards something soft and old, and I wiped a glass until the reflection of the room blurred. On the VIP side, the private room kept its own light. A man sat there alone, the kind of presence that can be measured by how many people change their posture when he looks at the door. He didn't look like the men who came to Bellissimo for show and stories. He had the patience of someone wearing power like an old coat, unadorned, heavy, sure. When my phone buzzed in my apron pocket, I nearly ignored it. I only checked it because Nona could call at any minute, and when your grandmother's breathing hangs on a thread, you learn to answer, even in bad places. I fished the thing out with sauce on my thumb and saw the caller's name spelled wrong, the digits unfamiliar. I answered in Italian because that's how I had always done it when panic rose in my chest. It steadied the voice the way salt steadies a dish. Pronto, I said. Her voice came thin and immediate, the vowels folded like paper, the words urgent and tidy. Sophia, it's me. Please, I can't. I didn't give her time to finish. I stepped back toward the kitchen, half expecting to lower my voice, to make it the private thing it already was. I was not expecting eyes on me. I should have known better. The private room's unspoken gravity tipped toward the door as if the room pulled at the sound itself. The man looked up. He didn't smile. He watched my face as if he'd been waiting for the language to form. Parle inglese, he asked when I returned the phone to my ear. Not unkind, the words careful but not curious. He could have asked in any tongue and gotten the same answer. I kept Nona's voice in my ear and mouthed an apology that didn't need translating. Mi dispiace, it's my grandmother, I said, because it was true and because it softened whatever he wanted to know. Calling it an exaggeration to say the whole room held its breath would be exaggerationless. People at the other tables leaned in suddenly to the private choreography of their own lives. Marco appeared to take another order, as if nothing strange had happened, but his eyes were maps of concern. The man, Dante Ricci, had fingers that were long enough to suggest a violinist, with a small crescent scar at the base of the thumb. He watched the pause in my voice, and then watched me put the phone away. The private room had barred windows within the restaurant's universe. The outside world felt like a rumor. I shouldn't have answered. My rational brain ticked over that one thought like a metronome. But I'd been raised with the idea you be there for blood. Nona's voice had trembled. She had said my name like a prayer in the half-sentence she had given me. You make choices then that you will spend the rest of your life explaining to yourself. When I brought the bread basket into the private room, Dante didn't have the eyes of a man who wanted to be entertained. He had the eyes of someone cataloging the room. He asked nothing. He spoke as if knowing the language was a small favor, not a threat. And he thanked me for something I had not done, with a ceremony I did not want. You're from Boston, he said when Marco had moved on. It was a statement. He didn't look for correction, only confirmation. I nodded. He smiled then, slight but precise, the smile of someone composing a ledger. It's rare, he said in Italian, then switched seamlessly to English, as if testing my accent, to hear it at a place like this. There are lives that begin with fireworks, and lives that begin with whispers. Mine began with a phone, a grandmother's voice, and a man named Dante who kept his hands on the table as if measuring the distance to the world. That should have been the end of it, but life rarely negotiates in single acts. Marco pulled me aside after the rush, his face pale with the kind of worry that disguises itself as orders. The owner wants to see you, he said. That's what he said. He could have said anything and I would have followed. His tone was the kind you hear when small things must be made into something larger. The private room's door clicked shut behind me, and the kitchen's heat turned cold. If you're the kind of person who likes cinematic, true crime romance stories, hit subscribe for more. The office offer. Dante's office sat above the main dining floor, like a small, restrained theater. Dark wood, a low-lit lamp, the smell of old books and expensive tobacco that he didn't smoke, but that seemed to have settled there as if it belonged. He offered me coffee, which I declined, and in a moment the small formalities were done, and the room settled into the business of us. He did not open with compliments. He opened with observation. You speak fast when you lie, he said once, and I laughed because there was nothing else to do. He was not joking. He slid a slim envelope across the desk that caught the lamplight. Inside were tickets and more than a month's rent. Inside were the kind of bills you recognize with a small, immediate shame. He knew where Nona lived. He knew things about my grandfather that I had only heard told between family meals, in the naughty quiet of people who do not want to remember. How do you know about my grandfather?
I asked because it was the only honest thing to demand. You have Russo on your file, he said, not unhelpfully. Antonio Russo worked for my father. The name hung in the air like a history lesson. He kept accounts. He had a ledger, you understand, and some debts can become family obligations. I thought of Nona on the bad days, her thin hands, the way she tucked stray hair back behind an ear as if she could stitch herself into something sturdier. I thought of my father's fewer words and my grandfather's disappearing cigarettes. I thought of the ledger as if it were a map, and of the ways maps can be misread. He offered me travel under the pretense of work, 2 weeks as a translator for an upcoming meeting in Florence. He offered the envelope, the flight, the temporary job, and a promise that sounded like insurance. There was an ease to the generosity that made my stomach roll. Why me? I asked. I asked the question many times in those first hours because it steadied me to hear my own voice. Why help now? Why pay? Why tell me things about my family? His answer was short and precise. Because you answered a call, he said. Because language is a small door into understanding. Because it has been a long time since anyone in your line answered the phone. It sounded like a riddle, and it sounded like an order disguised as logic. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He held out the tickets and a business card with an address I knew only vaguely, old money written with modern hands. He put a small white device on the table next to the envelope. It looked like a phone, but smelled faintly of metal and new leather. For you, he said, so you can call her when you're with her, so you will not have to wonder. I told myself I would insist on terms. I would insist I could go home after 2 weeks. I would insist that I was not someone who could be bought. In the end, the ledger of the world had already been written for me by poverty and by love. I took the ticket because my moral calculus kept the same balance. Nona's life on one side, my pride on the other. The ticket outweighed the pride. He asked nothing about consent. He assumed compliance like a fact. I told him, plainly, what mattered. I go to see my grandmother, 2 weeks. I translate, I come back. My voice sounded small in that room. He looked at me then with something that did not fit in the rubrics men usually wore. No anger, no exact kindness, but an interest that was almost parental. 2 weeks, he repeated slowly. If you need more, we will speak. There was an almost audible pause, and something shifted in his expression as if he'd chosen a phrase on a menu. Don't let her leave. He said it to someone over the phone, and the words snapped the room closed. They were addressed, I later understood, to the man who handled the envelope's second life, the man who did not work at Bellissimo, but whose presence you felt in the hush. I heard the voice on the other line respond with a soft acknowledgement I could not translate. Dante's jaw moved in the manner of someone who had given orders 1,000 times. The phrase lodged in my chest in a way it was not meant to. It could mean protection. It could mean possession. He could have been telling a nurse to ensure Nona's care until I arrived. He could have been telling a bodyguard to make sure I couldn't leave the seat where I had been found. The ambiguity was the trap. Before the evening was over, he gave me a small packet of information about the trip. Names, dates, safe words. He told me he'd provided 1,500 euros for immediate use, enough for any emergency. He told me there would be someone at the airport to accompany me. He told me, with a civility that pretended to be liberating, that he'd sent a car to the hospice beforehand. I imagine some people would hear that and call it manipulation. I did too, later on, with the sharp hindsight of someone who knows how stories end. In that office, it was a rope thrown across a river. I was cold and alone, and had granite under my feet where I needed only a ledge. I took the rope. The preparation. Back in the staff locker, my hands trembled as if I had run a marathon that began at the start of my life. Marco tried to shoulder the weight of normalcy. He tucked a towel under his arm and offered jokes that were thin and brittle. You got lucky, he said, and I did not tell him about the moment when Dante said my family's name, as if it were paper he might fold carefully into his pocket. I packed in fits and starts that night, clothes folded like small confessions, a breath mint, a photograph of Nona in a faded frame that I considered but left on the counter. There was a way in which going felt like dispersing a ghost of myself.
I was moving my body through the world of other people who could convince themselves they were being kind. I wrestled with the thought that maybe I was trading my life for a goodbye. At the airport, a man waited who did not look like a bodyguard in the Hollywood sense. He was tidy and ordinary in a way that made him more dangerous. Danger disguised itself in the look of someone who had practiced being normal. He introduced himself as Bruno. He did not ask for paperwork. The flight stretched like a cheap film, a cabin of hush, the hum of engines, the small economies of light. Dante did not speak much on the plane. He watched, and watching is a language by itself. I learned the sound of his authorization in the way he tapped the leather armrest, the way his knuckles registered. I learned how people who needed to control their history marked a room as their own. I tried to sleep. I tried to imagine what Florence smelled like. I thought of the hospice's narrow windows, of the rosemary that grew in Nona's courtyard, and the sound of the neighbor's radio at dusk.
I thought of the way my mother had once said, "You cannot save everyone," and then went back to silent cigarettes. He handed me a phone that night across the armrest between us, the same device he'd placed on his desk. It was a strange kind of intimacy, to be given connectivity by someone who had laid out the map of your movement. "Call her when it helps," he said. "Call her when you can't breathe." There was tenderness wrapped in the control, and often you find those two things bundled together, a gift and a bar. I told myself I would not let him define the limits of my life. The flight and the quiet between. Air travel shrinks lives into seat pockets and in-flight meals. It is the easiest place to be honest with yourself or to lie convincingly forever. I watched Dante's profile against the window and realized I could dissect the man by his silences. He had the kind of patience carved by habit. When he finally spoke after liftoff, it was not to me at first, but into a line of private calls, words clipped, efficient, names dropped like pebbles: Antonio, Marco Bianchi, Elio Ferrero. I did not know them then the way I would learn their faces later, each with its own dangerous gravity. He asked me about Nona in those in-between hours, as if testing the limits of my loyalty. "How long has she been ill?" he asked. "She's old," I said, which is to say she was 80 and had folded into a body that forgot small things. She lives on rosemary and stubbornness. He let a small laugh out, and when his eyes met mine, there was no judgment, only an interest that made me uncomfortable. "You kept her in Boston?" "No," I said, and the truth felt lighter. "She's in Florence." He did not bother to hide the faint twitch of approval. Florence for him was a town to be conducted in. For me, it was the geography of origin, the place where the ledger of my life had been inked in smaller fonts. He folded his hands on his lap like someone closing a book. "Then we will go home," he said, and I did not make the joke about sold futures. I spent the rest of the flight trying to map what had happened into words that made sense. A phone, a man, a ticket. It all sounded small when you said it out loud. It sounded enormous when you felt it in your bones. Arrival. We landed in a sky that smelled like old stone and rain. Florence looked the way marble ages, patient and deliberate. At the hospice, I felt the world settle into a more honest frame. Nona's hands were thinner than I'd remembered, and her eyes lit with a private brightness when she saw me. "Sophia Mia," she said, and all the reasons for the trip condensed into those two syllables. Dante did not come with me into the hospice room. He stayed in the reception area like someone pacing the edge of the map, and sent Maria, a woman with a face the color of roasted coffee, who introduced herself with a curt smile and an English that softened the edges. Maria moved with the ease of someone who knew the names of everyone in a room by the time she'd finished a single sentence. The first night I sat with Nona, and the world narrowed to the sound of her breath, the scratch of her fingers against the blanket. There was a telephone on the bedside table. It scratched at intervals like a small bird. I thought of the device Dante had given me and the way its newness smelled. The hospice's fluorescent light painted the walls a merciless white. I watched Nona sleep and thought I had traded a lifetime for one more good morning. When I walked out to the small courtyard, Dante was there, leaning against the low wall, his coat tight against the rain. He had a cigarette he didn't smoke, a habit for people who like the idea of fire without the mess.
She is well cared for, he said without preamble, as if answering a question I had not asked. You didn't have to, I started. I didn't finish. Gratitude and suspicion braid easily when you are alive. I know what indebtedness looks like, he said. He didn't say whose debt that was exactly, only that he understood the weight of it. He watched a woman cross the courtyard, a nurse with the precise shuffle of someone who had seen the world lean into death in a room that smelled of lemon disinfectant. You could have done any number of things, I said, because I needed the claim of speech to make it real. He shrugged, an economy of gesture. I did this because you answered the phone in my presence, he said, and the sentence did not come with apology. It put you on my account. He used the word as if it were ledgered. I told him my reasons, the ones that fit neatly in a suitcase, and the ones that did not. I said I had a need to say goodbye. He listened and then, gently, carefully, told me his expectation, that while I was there, I would be useful. Useful is a flat word that means different things depending on who is using it. It could mean translating menus and negotiating dietary restrictions. It could mean passing along names, phrases, impressions. It could mean being present at tables where business is quietly done. He never used the word explicitly, but the outline of it was there beneath his civility. By midnight, the courtyard felt like a pocket of the city the rest of us had been permitted to enter. I felt, absurdly, like someone who had stepped onto a stage without a costume. I kept thinking of the phrase he'd spoken earlier, "Don't let her leave," and of how many meanings the words could carry. I had not slept for more than 2 hours. The next day was the sort of daylight that clarifies things too quickly. It strips away the comfort of shadows and shows what you must face in the open. I should have gone home. Instead, I followed the plan I'd been given, because the ledger of one's life often arrives wrapped in practicalities, a car outside at 9, an address, a time.
When you are new to someone else's world, you learn quickly what the rules are by how people look at you. In Dante's world, the look was the most precise instrument. It could measure the thickness of a lie, the way water divides from oil. It could also be used to promise safety, which is perhaps the cruelest lie of most control. The first week moved like a slow fever. I learned 3 things quickly: how to be present without being folded into a story not mine, how to translate without romanticizing, how to stand at the edge of a room and learn the names of men whose hands made the economy of the continent. I translated for dinners that smelled of lemon and old leather. Men spoke in money and allegory, and I turned their words into plain sentences for the brief notes Dante wanted. I learned to put my voice into the soft valley between languages, to make their threats into the neutral air of business. It was draining in the way that honesty can be. The first time I saw the warehouses in conversation, I understood the outline of the business in a way that lost the illusions. It was not detailed, but the suggestion was clear. Boxes moved at night, human beings arranged like stock. Men argued about ledgers and weight and ports, not people. I felt something close to nausea, an unspooling that said the world I had been granted to enter carried costs I could not deny. And yet, even then, there were moments of small, almost unfair gentleness. Dante would stand by the hospice window sometimes, and he would bring back small things: an extra blanket folded with the precision of someone who adores order, a bag of Nona's favorite biscuits. He spoke to Nona in a way that was almost shy, and he never imposed himself on her. He maintained a distance that felt respectful and calculated at the same time. One night, after a dinner that had seemed to wrap itself in secrets, he sat beside me on the hospice's low wall and said quietly, "Your grandfather kept accounts. He saved names. People who keep names are dangerous because they remember when others would rather forget." It was the first time he used the word dangerous as a compliment. I felt my backbone shut like a book. There was a tenderness in the remark that made my shoulders ache. I kept asking myself why I stayed. The answer, when it came, was never singular. I stayed for Nona. I stayed because leaving now felt like abandoning a last ledger of family. I stayed because in staying, I kept a small measure of control. If I could not control the men's businesses and their black currants, I could at least control where my body slept and what I refused. But the ledger of this world never allowed for absolute refusals. There were small incidents, an envelope left at the hospice desk with a note that read simply, "Stay." An unknown man at the corner who watched the hospice's windows like it was a theater. The subtle tightening of security whenever I would leave. Each one of these things was a cord tied slowly around a limb,
so that by the time I noticed the constraint, it felt less like force and more like habit. When I found the dossier, a neat typed file hidden under a stack of restaurant receipts in my temporary room, I realized the breadth of his watching. It contained a list of addresses, old photographs, notes about my grandfather's ledger, an outline of debts. It also contained a small, polite letter that read, in effect, that my choices would be respected so long as they fit within certain terms. I burned the leaflet in the sink without telling anyone, the pages curling like paper shrieks. I told myself that destroying the evidence of being known was a defiant thing. I also knew that burning paper does not unmake a ledger in the minds of men who keep accounts. That should have been the last time I let anyone buy my silence. Instead, I boarded the private car that had arrived to take me to a villa outside the city, a place Dante said was safer for Nona and for the kind of quiet we needed. The car smelled like cedar and something sweet. Bruno sat in the front, and his hands lay on the steering wheel like a man who keeps order with his palms. I watched Florence slip by an old stone and new shadow and wondered whether I had walked into a cage that was lined with velvet. The answer did not come easily. All I knew was the small ledger in my hands, days counted now in permissions, gestures of care measured with the same scale as men's demands. When the villa appeared, a house that had grown out of a landscape like a stern and careful thought, I felt the world rearrange. Maria met us at the gate with a key in her hand and a face that softened when she saw Nona. She opened the door with a certainty that welcomed yet circled the edges of privacy. Inside, the room smelled of lemon oil and old wood and the faint ghost of Dante's cologne, something woody and citrus, unmistakably him. He watched me then in a way that was not private. He watched me inhabit the rooms like someone cataloging new entries. "You will have a room close to Nona," he said. The arrangement sounded kind. It also sounded conditional. That night I lay awake with the villa's silence ringing in my ears. I thought of all the ways a person can be visible and invisible at once, how your presence can be used like currency. I thought about the phone that sat on the bedside table and Dante's words on the line, "Don't let her leave." I did not yet know whether the phrase was a promise or a shackle. What I knew was simpler and crueler. Answering that call had changed everything. Villa days. The villa learned my shape before I did. In the mornings, sunlight flattened over the stone terraces and made the lemon trees glow like small suns. Mornings smelled of coffee ground sharp and the faint sour of oil.
At night, the rooms kept their history, the way some people keep photographs, lined up, deliberate, each object a reminder of who had passed through. Maria kept everything in its place. She moved through the villa with the certainty of someone who had been given the key to other people's secrets and had chosen to be gentle with them. My room was small but precise, a single bed, a bureau, a narrow window that opened onto Rosemary and the back fields. Dante chose the room close to Nona, though he never announced it as a favor. He announced it as a necessity. "Close to her," he said simply, "so you will hear if she needs you." It was a kind way to put a tether. The days settled into a rhythm that taught me more than any sudden shock could. I translated, I learned names, I held phones to ears, and I watched men turn polite sentences into the leverage that ran cities. I found myself at tables with men who treated the world like a chessboard and people like pawns that could be moved and sometimes sacrificed for greater positioning. I translated words about shipping manifests and port codes without knowing the whole of what they concealed. I began to understand, slowly, the architecture of Dante's life. Security tight but not oppressive, favors extended and recorded, a network of obligations that supported him like a scaffolding. He watched me by degrees. At first, it was the look that measured the fit of a dress or the way I positioned my hands when I spoke. Then it became the small kindnesses, a preferred tea brewed and left on the bedside table, a soft bathrobe waiting on the chair, a letter from someone who pretended to be an old school friend with an invitation to a quiet lunch. There was a calculus to every gift. It read as courtesy up front. The receipt was always implied. Maria was my clearest gauge of what the villa allowed.
She had hands that smelled of basil and years, hands that fished out a blister bandage without making a fuss, that smoothed the sheet on Nona's bed, that slipped me an extra orange when Dante wasn't watching. She had been in Dante's employ long before I arrived, and she had rules that were older than loyalty, practical rules about what to say and where to keep your eyes. She called me Senorina with affection that did not cross the line. She told me once, over a pot of boiled artichokes, to remember your feet. "You must remember your feet, yes?" she said, snapping the leaves with a practiced hand. "They will tell you the truth when the hands want other things." I kept thinking about my feet and what they told me, that I was tired, that I was frightened, and sometimes that I was choosing. That last truth was a stubborn one. I could feel it like the shape of a coin in my pocket. Each morning I could trade it for another small certainty, Nona's bowl of soup, an extra hour of sleep when the villa's night guard adjusted his perimeter, a clean towel folded with a precision meant to soothe a household that used precision as protection. There were nights when Dante would bring me to the main room and ask me to sit at the edge of a table because he wanted me to translate a phrase or to be present for the cadence of a sentence. The men around the table measured one another with small gestures. Their hands smoothed their glasses, or they tapped the table with the suggestions of ownership. Often the things they discussed were banal in the way that great harm often is: paperwork, shipments, the relative reliability of a new port contact. They spoke in a kind of code that I could read only when the language loosened, when anger shook a voice into clarity. At one such dinner, Alio Ferrero sat across from me and smiled like a man who thought the world owed him everything and had grown impatient waiting for it. He was polished in the right places and cracked in the wrong ones. He smelled faintly of strong aftershave and impatience. He had a way of looking at people that made me feel like a puzzle he wanted to prise open. "Tell us," he said in a voice that slid honeyed to Dante. "Your girl knows more about our ports than the official registers. She speaks like she keeps numbers in her head." My mouth tasted like lemon rind. I translated the sentence exactly. I made it a flat bridge between two languages. Dante's fingers moved to his glass and back like a metronome. He looked at me then in a way that was not private. "You will only say what we ask," he said lightly to me. It was not an order in the raised voice sense. It was an order wrapped in the civility of a man who believed civility expended better when it concealed a blade. I had learned by then to place my words like a bridge that must hold weight without trembling. I kept myself light enough to move, but steady enough to not snap. The wardrobe and the gift of clothes. The first time he brought me new clothes, I felt a small, immediate shame in the pleasure. They fit as if made for a different version of me. A silk dress that lengthened my legs, a box of shoes that smelled of smooth glue and dust. Dante watched me try them on like a man doing an inventory. Maria looked on and pretended not to notice the way my posture shifted. "You should wear what makes you comfortable," she said, handing me an old cardigan I had nervously tugged around my shoulders. "Comfortable is a dangerous word here," I replied, and she smiled in the understanding of someone who had been asked to choose their language carefully for decades. He gave me a string of pearls one evening, presented as a simple object wrapped in tissue. They felt heavy with the kind of history that pearls carry, strata of tiny irritations refined into brightness.
He did not ask me to wear them, but he watched me fasten them at my throat as if measuring how the jewel altered the line of me. The necklace gleamed like a decision. The gifts were convenient shields for him, easy measures of his willingness to protect, and complicated shackles for me. Each present suggested a possibility of obligation and an assumption about what I might give in turn. I learned to accept them with a face that did not show the ledger I kept in my head, gratitude on one side, resentment on the other. The warehouse evening. It was supposed to be a routine visit to a storage compound outside the city. I had been told to accompany Dante because they needed a neutral ear to translate a foreign supplier's points. On the drive, the air smelled of diesel and the nervous hush that comes with industrial edges. The warehouse confirmed my worst impressions. Inside, men moved with the kind of precise brutality I had seen only in cinematic clichés. Crates stacked like solemn blocks, forklifts that hummed like beasts, and the men who directed them moving with the economy of someone who had practiced coercion until it looked like work. Inside an office off the main floor, men argued about manifests and weight and ports.
I translated as requested. The words hovered between business and the unsaid. The unsaid was a chasm that made my stomach clench. One of the men, an associate whose name would later appear in holes of conversation, spoke of routes that bypassed inspections and of documents that kept their own realities. He used the word consolidated, as if people were commodities to be repackaged. When the meeting broke, a man whom I later learned was an auditor for a shipping syndicate pressed his palm to the papers with a casualness that suggested he was used to writing off irregularities with a smile and the right touch. The man's eyes met Dante's, and the two spoke in the way of people who share a secret with the world, half-truths and promises ensured by mutual benefit. It was on the way out that I felt the small animal panic that rises when you understand you have looked too far into a machine. A pair of men followed us, just far enough to make me aware of their presence, but close enough that the line between protection and surveillance was invisible. When I asked about them, Dante shrugged as if it were a small, ordinary matter. "They are precautions," he said. "We overdo them sometimes." I knew what that meant. A network of people whose job was to remind me that I was not entirely free to move in the world as I once had. I felt anger at myself for the irrational hope that a few small niceties meant safety. I also felt anger at Dante for making the niceties the instrument of a tighter hold. That evening, after we had returned to the villa and the lights had dimmed, Dante came to my room with a cup of tea. He sat on the low chair by the window and didn't ask permission to be there the way a guest might. He was simply present.
"You looked like someone who had seen too much," he said, the sentence offered as a comfort. "I saw what you do," I replied. It was blunt. It cut away the small politenesses I sometimes felt obligated to keep. His mouth twitched. "You translated it well," he offered. "You were precise." "It wasn't precision that made it worse," I said. "It was the imagination of what those crates might mean." He listened then, in the way people listen when they are actually absorbing a confession. For a moment I felt absurdly heard. Then he reached toward the windowsill and took a small silver lighter from his pocket, an affectation of someone who possessed fine things, but did not necessarily need them. "You have a choice," he said quietly. "You can leave. You have a ticket back. You can take it and go." I felt my ribs close around that simple fact. "You offered that for Nona," I said, "not as charity." "It was both," he said, "a debt and a kindness." "You know you watch me," I said. It was not a question. It was a small collision of truth. He nodded. "I watch the people I am responsible for," he said. "It is different from possession." "Is it?" I asked. It was a test as much as it was a plea. He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was in a softer voice. "We offer shelter," he said. "We also expect loyalty." We sat like that for a long time. I let the sentence turn over in my head and found it tasted of iron. Shelter with conditions. Protection rendered as a contract. In my mind, I compared the ledger of the villa, security, warmth, food, with the ledger my grandfather had kept. Names, debts, obligations, a long memory. The similarity made me want to vomit. The kiss and the boundary. It is easy in memory to turn a single gesture into a turning point. The truth is more complicated. There were nights when Dante's presence was simply company, his hand sketching nothing decisive. There were other nights when the space between us charged like weather before thunder. I remember one late night, Nona asleep, the villa quiet, when he moved closer to me on the low wall by the courtyard and reached for my hand in a way that was neither purely tender nor purely transactional. He did not force my hand. He asked it in the softest of ways and put my palm against his chest. I felt the steady beat beneath the shirt, his heart, a proof that whatever he was also human. He leaned toward me and kissed me, slow as if asking permission in the space between breaths. I remember being surprised by the way it felt tender and invasive at the same time. I pulled back after the first kiss, not out of outrage, but in the exact manner of someone who wanted to delineate a boundary that might remain mine. "Dante," I said, because names anchor us when we are about to do something that might rearrange a life. He looked at me then as if trying to gauge a measurement. "Do you want me to stop?" he asked, and his voice opened with something like worry. "I want to know what this means," I said. "I want to know where the line is." He exhaled. "It means I am human and flawed," he said simply. "It also means I want to be near you." There was a gentleness in that admission. There was also a danger. The line he proposed smoothed into existence, proximity under his conditions. I told him then that I would not be a possession, that I would not, for the sake of comfort or for Nona, give up my right to speak no. He accepted my refusal with a small nod. He did not protest. He did not unsettle the arrangement that had been settled since the ticket. But in the nights that followed, I could feel the invisible architectures of his attention. He watched my comings and goings. He asked subtle questions about who had called me and why. He cultivated an intimacy that measured me daily. The betrayal. The pattern might have continued. The villa's small securities, the dinners, my translation at tables, if not for the way other men's ambitions shaped themselves into threats. Alio Ferrero's smile hardened into predation. He developed a cadence of comment that felt like it was meant to unsettle and to test the limits of my usefulness. When Dante started speaking less to certain associates and more to others, a small fissure widened into conflict. It was in Milan, at a gallery opening, glittering with men who possess money like a costume, that I first understood the reach of their rivalries. We were there because Dante wanted to place a piece with Carlo Martelli, an art collector who had the taste for objects that legitimized wealth. The room smelled of perfume and varnish. Men spoke loudly into small phones. I moved through the crowd like a shadow. Later that night, at a dinner that felt too orchestrated for comfort, Ferrero cornered me under the pretense of complimenting a translation. He lowered his voice and offered me something that reeked of premeditation. "You are every girl's fantasy here," he said. "You have power without knowing how to use it." I smiled the way you do when a snake speaks politely. I translated the line into nothing at the table, but in the washroom afterward, my hands shook. I told Dante that Ferrero had been talkative. He listened, and his jaw tightened like a fist. Days later, a police detachment, men wearing the gray of the financial police, arrived at one of Dante's warehouses. It was an ambush that felt like a page torn from a novel about crimes made visible. The men were efficient, cameras snapped, and paper was confiscated. Dante's world tilted for a short, violent moment. The men who coordinated the raid were not outside agents acting alone. Someone had guided them. Someone had fed them the hint, the evidence, the whisper that sets the machine of legal wrath into motion. Dante moved like someone who kept missiles pre-located for exactly this kind of strike. He did not panic. He polished his face with the same calm that he polished other matters.
He began to speak about mistakes as if cleaning a wound. We would contain, we would negotiate, we would find who had betrayed us. It was then that I realized the betrayal was not merely about business. It was also about taking power through exposure. The men who wanted Dante weakened understood that exposing a vulnerability in his business would force him to spend resources to repair it. And as he did, his enemies could move on other theaters. Ferrero's name floated into conversation like a polluting scent. Dante's eyes told me what his mouth did not. This was personal. He moved us to Switzerland over a few frantic days, and the villa's calm made for a different kind of cage. The move was framed as safety for Nona, and a means to regroup. The truth sat beside this practical reason like a hard stone. Dante needed a place with fewer prying authorities and more loyal hands. He needed a mountain that blurred lines. Switzerland, the chalet. The chalet smelled of wood smoke and alpine air, a clarity that made my bones ache after the heavy humidity of Italy. It was smaller than the villa, and colder in the way of alpine light, but it had windows that opened to long lines of pines and a lake that held the sky like a secret. Maria stayed, Bruno was constant, Alessandra arrived with a discreet competence that made the house run on clockwork. We arrived in the morning. Nona's breath was shallow and fragile, but when I put my cheek against her hand, she squeezed and whispered the name we had 1,000 times made into a charm, Sophia. It felt as if the world had shrunk into that small script, and there was nothing else to do but be in that precise place at that precise time. Switzerland allowed for small rituals. I learned them. Early walks, tea at the same hour, newspapers folded in the same place. Dante would sit across from Nona and read the paper as if he were a man trying to memorize a life that had been imprinted with obligations. He spoke less in those days, and when he did, there were pauses shaped like apologies. One afternoon, in the library, he set down a glass and finally decided to speak of the ledger in a way that felt like confession. He laid out certain facts with the whipped, efficient tone of someone enumerating assets: the network, the need for protection, the cost of enemies. He spoke of a length of time the family had been involved in arrangements across borders, and then, almost casually, said, "Your grandfather's accounts were exact. He recorded things others did not want remembered." There was a way in which his voice grew softer when he said my family's name. "He saved names," he said. "He saved debts. That is how I know you." "And what does that demand of me?" I asked. because I needed to name the terms out loud. "It demands nothing until it does," he said. It was a precise way of speaking that still left room for dread. "It is an account that has to be kept. Sometimes accounts require settlement with time." The truth of that sentence, the way it dangled spoilers of future obligations, sat like a stone in my chest. I tried to make it small by counting the hours in which I would sit with Nona, by measuring the flatness of the lake, by tending the household tasks that made the days similar. Yet the ledger of expectations expanded to fill whatever space was left. When Nona's coughing worsened, we called the doctor, who recommended a quiet hospice in the village for the last days. The doctor's assessment was gentle and precise, and suggested a timeline that made my stomach hollow. Russia had a way of making even time have edges, defined hours, defined ways to present grief. I prepared for the final period like someone closing a book. I called Bruno and Maria and asked them to make certain arrangements. Dante moved like someone at war with public suffering. He arranged comfort, he arranged privacy. The decision. I still remember sitting on the porch the night before Nona's final hospitalization, the sky a cold dish of stars above the lake. Dante joined me without announcement. The night smelled of pine and the small sharpness of stove-heated air. I told him about a time when Nona had taught me to braid rosemary into small bundles for luck, how she would press them into my hands and tell me to carry the smell of home in my coat. He listened, and for once his face did not harden into the ledger's politeness. "You are allowed to leave," he said then. It was not a question. He had a way of offering permission because he had been giving it for so long. His generosity sounded like command. "I cannot leave Nona," I said, because it was the truth, and because the phrase felt like an armor. "You can arrange to leave later," he said. "You can keep this life for a time, and then return to the life you had." "You keep reminding me of the choices I can make," I said, "but you never tell me how to actually make them." "You must choose for yourself," he replied. "I cannot choose for you." The sentence should have been freeing. Instead, it felt like a cruel way of pinpointing the truth. Everything here required me to choose, but each choice altered the ledger. I lay awake that night imagining ledger lines and the way debt counts itself into a life, how the smallest favors could add up until you were entirely owned by the sum of them. The crisis. Nona's last hours were mercifully sharp and uncomplicated. She woke briefly and looked at me with the small brightness I had known my whole life and mouthed my name. I held her hand and told her about the rosemary and the way the light in the kitchen caught the coffee pot in the mornings. She smiled and died with my name in the soft shell of a sentence that seemed to forgive everything. The day after, the villa held a small private ceremony. Maria arranged every detail with a tenderness that felt like healing. Dante sat in the front row like a man who had come to terms with the cost he had paid. He spoke at the graveside with a short speech that mentioned debts repaid and memories honored, and something about the words he used had the weight of sincerity. Men in suits bowed their heads. Bruno stood slightly behind him, like a shadow, with a posture of fidelity. Grief made the villa quieter. The echo of absence was a new thing. I felt my life like a thread for a time, fragile, snagged at the edges, uncertain where it would be woven next. For days I walked the paths Nona had favored, and found myself reaching into the pockets where she had hidden small candies and notes. I discovered, in the silence that followed, both a strange emptiness and a sense of being untethered. The retribution came like a series of small avalanches. Ferrero's plot to weaken Dante had not gone unnoticed. Men who had been hungry for advantage suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered. There were threats sent back and settlements made. Some of the violence was visible in the way alliances shifted. Investors pulled money, competitors found their shipments mysteriously delayed. Other acts were quieter, reputations undermined, doors closed at moments when one most needed passage. I was told nothing of the details, precisely because some truths travel better as rumors. I watched the effects. Alio Ferrero's name began to come with a silence. He stopped being invited to certain dinners. A rumor spread that he had fled to a smaller market when he had found himself short of support. The men who once circled him began to align themselves elsewhere. Not every act of revenge was clean. I heard whispers, distant, the sort of gossip that doesn't carry ownership but implication, that Ferrero had been hurt in ways that made the rest of the men reconsider the wisdom of open aggression. I did not watch how it was done. I observed the fallout. Men withdrew their attention from those who had been careless. The ledger shifted. One night, long after Nona was buried, Dante came to me with a dossier I had once found in the villa. It lay on his desk like a confession, its pages neat, the holes punched in specific places where certain facts had been removed. He did not ask me to look, but he turned it toward me like someone passing a book to a friend so the friend could read the footnotes. "I tried to protect it," he said. "I tried to protect them." "Did you do the right thing?" I asked. It was a blunt question because I wanted a clean answer. He looked at me with a tiredness I had not seen before. "I do not know what a right thing is anymore," he said. "There are degrees of wrongness. We pick the one that avoids the greatest harm, and sometimes that is only a matter of degree." I thought of my grandfather's ledger then, and how he had kept names and accounts. I thought of how, in the end, every family has ledgers, the ones they put in drawers and the ones they write with their actions.
I realized that I had been drawn into a long string of accounts and payments, and that my own small choices would echo. Choosing to stay. There came a point when staying stopped being about protection and started being about the only form of agency I felt I had. In the hush that followed the funeral, Dante began to offer me a life that looked like stability, a house, legitimate introductions, a way to pass through rooms with my head high without explaining myself. He proposed something that looked like marriage, the clarity and the contract that come with names and vows. He proposed it quietly, a question posed at a table where the blinds let light sketch across the wood. "You could be mine in the way that means you are near," he said, not with the flamboyance of a dramatic offer, but with the blunt practicality of a ledger entry. A name, a date, a place. A wife if you accept it. Protection if you accept it. I sat with the sentence like a pill you have to swallow. There were many ways to interpret what it meant to be his. There were practical comforts, security for Maria, a staff that would look after the villa and the chalet, enough resources to ensure that I would never again choose between rent and medicine. There were intangible costs, an identity gradually rewired to fit a role. I thought of Nona and the small thing that had set this in motion, a call answered in Italian, in a restaurant, in a noisy city. I thought of the way my life had folded and refolded like an origami of small compromises. I thought of how I had measured my agency in the weeks since arriving, degrees of consent smoothed by circumstance. When I told Dante I needed time, he agreed. He gave me the kind of time he could afford, weeks under surveillance that read like quiet oversight, the staff increasingly attentive to my schedule. But the time he gave was generous because he could measure the risks and because he trusted the ledger would tilt in the direction he preferred. I considered leaving. Many nights I lay awake imagining myself at the airport, tickets in hand, the plane taking off while I watched the city shrink. I pictured the practical life I had left behind and the people who would perhaps note my absence with the same thinness of grief. Yet even in those flights, I could sense the nets that had been thrown, addresses noted, allies watchful, men who could make it difficult enough for someone to actually leave. I thought about the dossiers men like Dante keep, about the way a life can be mapped in phone numbers and past addresses, and the names of people who might be called upon. The more I imagined leaving, the more complicated it became. In the end, my choice to stay was not the decision of someone who had surrendered all hope of autonomy. It was a decision made in the narrow lane that ran between desire and survival. I stayed partly because I recognized the rare kindness that Dante had shown, arranging for Nona's last days with dignity, bringing those small, tangible comforts that had been rare in my life. I stayed because the world I had once known offered no guarantee that Nona's last days had been possible. I stayed because sometimes we trade a lesser freedom for the ability to keep someone else safe. I told him, after long nights of thinking and a day when I finally could speak without the tightness in my throat, that I would accept his proposal, but on my terms. "I will not be invisible," I said. "I will have a job. I will have access to certain freedoms. I will be able to see people who are not approved by Ledger." He listened, and then, with a stillness that felt almost religious, agreed to the conditions I set: a role that allowed me some independence, a promise that no harm would come to those I chose to keep in my life, and a candid admission that this arrangement would be precarious and imperfect. He signed the papers the way a man signs a long account, with care, with a flourish, and with the knowledge that a signature is both promise and contract. We had a small ceremony in the villa's chapel a few weeks later. It was not the fairy tale of the cinema. It was a quiet, legal, and intimate joining of two people tied in ways that felt like both choice and necessity. The aftermath. Life after the ceremony was not a tableau of perfected happiness. It was a strange domesticity inhabited by a woman who had been taught to bargain,
I learned how to set the table for men who had once been strangers, how to smile with a mouth that still kept the ledger in mind. I took a job that let me move through the legal pieces of Dante's businesses, publicly palatable lines of work that imitated normalcy. I kept my independence in small ways: a morning walk, a letter written to a friend in Boston, a few hours in the community center teaching English to migrants whose faces told stories like mine. There were consequences that required accounting. Men who had once been enemies found themselves diminished. Settlements were made in silence. Ferrero's departure from our circuit was a relief, but not a triumph. The absence of one predator meant only that others might step up. Dante paid for protection and for peace with the same careful mind he used for his business decisions. Sometimes I saw splashes of ruin. Small businesses closed abruptly, men who vanished from social circles, rumors that left some families rearranged. I never asked exactly how it was executed. I only observed how the ripples reached me and where they landed. Nona's memory became the compass by which I allowed myself to navigate these moral quagmires. I kept her recipes, her small sayings. "You always make the rosemary proud," she would have said, had she been alive.
I planted rosemary in the villa's yard and touched its leaves sometimes when I needed to remind myself of the woman who had taught me to answer calls no matter what. The smell of it anchored me. There were moments of tenderness that felt authentic. Dante learned how to be present without ownership at times. He learned to accept my refusal of certain intimacies and to show care in ways that were not transactional. He brought me a book by an author I loved once, and the gift tasted like someone remembered me enough to pay attention. Sometimes he made mistakes, assuming, ordering, suggesting in ways that still made me bristle, and I still bristled. Other times he was gentle in ways that surprised me, painting a small frame for one of Nona's photographs, bringing a neighbor's child a toy because he knew I liked to see life continue. There are nights when I would find myself replaying that first phone call, the vibration in my apron pocket, the sharpness of Nona's voice, Dante's eyes turning toward the door. I would think of how small decisions can be the hinge on which a life turns. I would think about the ledger my grandfather kept and how debts are repaid in forms that do not always match currency. Sometimes they involve favors. Sometimes they involve loyalty. Sometimes they involve unexpected kinds of love. The cost of choosing to stay did not dissolve over time. It gathered like dust in the corners of our days. A memory of someone harmed when men redirected their anger. A quiet knowledge that my name could bring interest from people who wanted a place in Dante's circle. There were days when I wondered whether I had exchanged one set of constraints for another. I asked myself sometimes whether the life I had chosen for survival had become a life I would have chosen for its own sake. There was no simple answer. There was only the worn reality of how choices shape us, and how we, in turn, justify them. Epilogue: The Small Call. Years later, after the dust had settled in ways that made for a clearer picture, but never a simple one, I would sometimes sit by the villa's low wall and watch the lemon trees sway in the same wind that had always moved them. Bruno moved in and out of the property like a constant. Maria watched the younger staff with the kind of care that suggested she had been given permission to keep the place together. Dante walked in measured steps that had been trained by a lifetime of practice. We kept to our small domesticities and the larger currents that would always disturb them. We had a small ceremony, an unostentatious affair, more of a consolidation of lives than a spectacle. There was grief in the crowd. Some men had been friends, some had been partners. Others had been instruments in a larger ledger. There were no fireworks, only the small and sticky happiness that comes from having someone near who knows the shape of your days.
Once, in a quiet, unplanned moment, Dante took my hand and squeezed it with the kind of gentleness that suggests both a claim and a plea. I looked at him and found my face composed of the lives that had made me: Boston and Florence, the hospice's fluorescent light and the chalet's cold stars, the ledger's numbers and the rosemary's smell. I had a story imprinted on me like a map. "Do you regret it?" he asked, because sometimes the people who keep the ledger want a moral accounting as much as a financial one. I thought of Nona, of the call that had started it all. I remembered the way she had breathed my name, the way the hospice's lights had felt like the end of a small, fragile life. I thought of the ledger my grandfather had kept, and how in the end it was memory that mattered. "No," I said. It was the best, honest answer I could give. It was also complicated. I never imagined my life would look like this.
I regret some things. I am grateful for others. He tightened his hand. Then we will keep trying for the good ones, he said. We tried then. We argued, and we loved in ways that were sometimes messy and sometimes faithful. I kept teaching English in small sessions, and I kept tending Rosemary. I kept translating, now for causes that were legitimate, and sometimes filled with the quiet hope of doing some small good with a voice once bought for a funeral trip. Sometimes I replay the first phone call in my head. I do not hear it with the same urgent panic I once had. Age polishes memory into different textures, but the line is there, the small decision lodged like a coin in my palm. I remember the way the restaurant's private room looked when Dante first turned his head, the way his eyes searched my face when I answered in Italian. I remember the ledger he spoke of, as if it were an apology and a promise. The command I had heard in his voice that night in his office, spoken softly into a phone to someone I didn't know, stayed with me like an ember. It was ambiguous, then and later. Protection, possession, vow. It had been an order issued into the world that changed everything. It had sounded like a command and like a promise. In the end, life is made of such small acts. A phone call in a restaurant is for most people nothing more than an interruption. For me, it was the hinge. I answered because I had to. I stayed because I thought it the only way to keep a promise to the woman who had taught me to speak in Italian and to braid rosemary between my fingers. I loved in ways that were messy and incomplete. I lost and I gained. I made accounts and paid them in whatever currency the world would allow. If you want more stories where a single choice changes everything, watch the next one.